If you want to stop losing at chess, then watch this video. Most people, they get the thought process all wrong. So today I'm going to be breaking down my entire thought process on how to go from the opening, transitioning into the middle game, and then the end game. My opponent is at 2200 but let's play the move knight f3, and I'm going to be breaking down to you guys how to play the Italian game and all the plans and ideas in the Italian game. So knight c6 was played. Let's go bishop to c4. This is the Italian game. And then my opponent plays the move bishop to c5. Now, in these types of positions, we could castle the king. We could play pawn to c3, which is very aggressive, or we could simply play pawn to d3. But because I'm trying to follow the principles in the opening, let's just castle the king, get the king out the center of the board. And then all we're trying to do from here is to continue with our development. So knight to f6 was played. It's very important that we look on the opponent's last move, check to see what the opponent was doing. Now, the opponent is attacking my pawn on e4. So I'm just going to play the move pawn to d3 here, just to protect the pawn. And then my opponent decided to castle their king. Now, in this position, all we're going to do is to continue with the development. So there's a few ways to finish our development here. It's very simple. We have a knight that is not developed. We have a bishop that is not developed. So what should we do? We should develop the knight and we should develop the bishop. So let's start by simply developing the knight. Now we only have one last piece to get developed. My opponent plays the move pawn to d6. And then in this position, I'm going to play the move bishop to g5. So we could say we are out of the opening stage of the game and we're now transitioning into the middle game. Now, once we're in the middle game, it's all about finding pieces that are not doing anything and put them on better squares. Now, the pieces that are not going to be doing anything is usually your rooks and your queen. A lot of person, they just don't play with their rooks and their queen. Now, it's very important that we look on the opponent's last move though. Pawn to h6 was played and pawn to h6 attacks my bishop. Now, if you have watched my content anytime at all, you should know that a bishop is better than a knight. Another thing that you need to know is if you have a bishop and it is pinning the opponent's knight to the queen, or it's pinning the opponent's knight to the king, don't take the knight. And you don't necessarily have to pull the bishop back all the way here. What you want to do is you want to pull the bishop back to h4, maintaining the pin on the knight. Now my opponent plays the move bishop to g5. Now he's also pinning my knight to my queen, but it's going to be the same thing. Now I'm sure all of you guys usually have these types of position. It's very symmetrical, and symmetrical basically means the same. I'm assuming you guys know that. So because the bishop comes on my half of the board, I'm going to play the move pawn to h3 and I'm going to chase the bishop from my half of the board. Now my opponent, being at 2200 but, gave up a bishop for a knight. That has to be a mistake. Now, I'm not going to take with the pawn. I'm going to take with the queen. Now, look what happens when I take with the queen. I'm going to take with the queen. I'm applying more pressure to the opponent's knight. Now, pawn to g5 was played. And this move, it basically attacks my bishop. I have to move the bishop. So let's just simply pull back the bishop. But if you notice, the opponent is exposing their king. Knight to d4 was played. A piece is on my half of the board. Whenever the opponent puts a piece on your half of the board, you have to try to be as aware as you can. You know, there has to be an alarm that goes off in your head. For example, the queen is attacking my knight. The knight is attacking my queen, obviously, but the knight is also attacking the pawn on c2. So I have to save my queen and ensure that I don't lose my c2 pawn. So let's just pull back the queen. And then the opponent plays the move pawn to c6. Maybe he wants to play pawn to d5 next, but a piece is on our half of the board. We know how to operate when a piece is on our half of the board. We need to use a principle called the principle of neutralization. We must neutralize that knight. So the move that I'm about to play here is knight to e2, pulling my knight back to e2, getting rid of the knight. He traded the knight. Let's just take back from here. There's now no piece on my half of the board. The pawn moves to b5, which means he's attacking my bishop. So let me just pull my bishop back in this position. And then pawn to a5 was played. Again, once the opponent makes a move, it's very important that we look on the opponent's last move so that way we could see what he's trying to do. Moving the pawn to a5 is actually threatening to trap my bishop. So I need to prevent this from happening. To prevent this from happening, I'm going to play the move pawn to a4. Now he's not able to move a pawn to a4. And then he plays king to g7. We're no longer in the opening. We're now in the middle game. A lot of persons that joins my academy, they're usually the person who they know what to do in the opening. It's obvious, get all the pieces out. But the moment they reach the middle game, that's when they don't know what to do. So what I'm about to show you guys now is what to do when you're in the middle game stage. So here's what we're gonna do. What pieces do we have that is not doing anything? Both of our rooks aren't really doing anything. And what do we know about rooks? We know that rooks needs files. You do not want to have your rooks pointing towards your own pawns. Rooks needs files. There's no file on the board. What I'm going to do in this position, I'm going to try to create an open file with the use of a pawn break. Now, the reason why persons don't know what to do in the middle game, this is because they lack planning abilities. They do not know how to plan. So let me just quickly break down to you how to plan in a chess game. Here's how it works. This is what I tell the students that joins my academy. Planning equals pawns. If you want to create a plan, look on the pawns. Now, after you look on the pawns, you want to create a pawn break or you want to do a pawn storm. I want to do a pawn break. So in this position, I'm going to play the move pawn to c3. My whole idea in this position is to play pawn to d4. And once I'm able to play a move like pawn to d4, it is going to open the D file, and then I'm going to be able to put a rook on the D file. However, a lot of person does not know how to count. So if I play the move pawn to D4 in this position, the opponent has two pieces covering the D4 square. I only have a pawn covering the D4 square. So what should we do? We need to ensure that we support the pawn advance. So my opponent just played the move queen to b8. That's a very interesting move. Again, we have to look on the opponent's last move. Let's look on the opponent's last move and see what effect does that move have on our half of the board. And this is how a lot of you guys may blunder, because maybe you're saying, okay, Akeem says not to allow pieces on our half of the board. There's not a lot of pieces on my half of the board. I'm doing fine. But you also need to check to see when a piece is pointing towards your half of the board. In this position, the queen is actually x-raying my bishop, and my bishop is unprotected. So if I'm not careful, the pawn is going to take, and then when I take back, my bishop is going to be unprotected, and I'm going to be down by a piece. So let's just move the bishop to c4. The bishop is now somewhere where it is guarded, so I'm fine. The opponent pulls their bishop back to b6. Doesn't really have a lot of effect on my half of the board. So what are we going to do now? We're going to play the move pawn to d4, which is a pawn break that has a lot to do with planning. Now my opponent moves the rook to e8, and just like that, if I take and then the opponent take, my rook will enjoy an open file. But I want to teach you guys another thing about chess. To take is a mistake. You should only trade when it improves your position. You should not trade if it does improve your position or there's no threat happening. So let's check the position and see if taking improves our position. So let's say I decide to take. If I takes and the opponent takes, my rook gets a file. Does that improve my position? You could say yes. What if I do not take? If I don't take and I decide to keep the tension, based on the opponent's last move, I could be at risk of losing a pawn. How? If the opponent takes on d4, then my pawn is going to be only guarded once by my queen, and the opponent is going to have two pieces guarding it, which means in this position, taking the pawn is not a mistake. But you could say it allows the opponent's bishop to get a good diagonal. So you also want to be aware of those things as well. Now, the move that I'm about to play here is pawn to h4. This should not be a hard move for you guys to find, because I already tell you guys, when it comes to planning, you have to think about pawns. When it comes to pawns, you have to think about pawn breaks and pawn storm. If I play the move pawn to h4 in this position, the opponent isn't really able to take, because once I take back, my bishop gets a better diagonal. Now, pawn takes c3 was played. I could ignore that and then simply take here. And then after the pawn takes, I don't really have any attack, so let's just take back first. And then the other good thing about this trade is the b file is now open. So my opponent just played the move rook to d1. What does this do? It threatens to trade rook. I'm thinking of trading, but the opponent is going to take with the bishop. If they take with the queen, then that's going to be a free pawn. So instead of just trading here, I'm going to first take on g5. So that way the pawn on g5, once my opponent recaptures, obviously, becomes an unprotected pawn. So because the pawn on g5 is now an unprotected pawn, it becomes a target in the opponent's half of the board. Pawns are targets on the opponent's half of the board. It doesn't necessarily have to be on the opponent's half of the board, but if it's a pawn, it's going to be on the opponent's half of the board. So here's my plan in this position. My plan is to attack this unprotected pawn. My plan is to apply more pressure to this unprotected pawn. What am I going to do? I'm going to play the move queen to f3. If I'm able to get my queen to f5, I'm going to be attacking g5 and e5 at the same time, and that's going to be a fork. My opponent just captured the rook on d1. Was that a good move? No. Why wasn't that a good move? Because to take is a mistake. You should only trade if it improves your position. Him taking my rook, it didn't help him. Look on this rook. This rook wasn't even doing anything. Now that I take back, the guy's just helping me to get an open file. And then he plays queen to e8. So basically, he's keeping his e5 pawn guarded, but his g5 pawn is still unprotected. And I also want to teach you guys another thing about chess. If you're able to evaluate a chess position, it's going to be a game changer for you. And what I mean by evaluating a chess position is you should be able to look on the chess position and know when a king is weak, know when there's an unprotected pawn, know when there's an unprotected piece. A king is weak when there's not a lot of pawns around it, by the way. So I'm going to play the move queen to f5 here. Again, we're still putting our pieces on the opponent's half of the board. The opponent plays the move rook to d8, and just like that, we're winning the game. Now, I could start by simply taking the rook, but we don't necessarily have to do that. Yes, he's attacking my rook, but offense is the best defense. So instead of paying attention to the fact that my rook is under attack, I'm going to play the most forcing move in the position. Queen takes g5, check. It comes with check, the king has to move, and I'm attacking the knight. Now, I don't want to get greedy and just take the knight here, by the way, because if I take the knight, I'm going to lose my rook. But I'm going to get very, very creative here. Now watch this. Remember when I tell you guys that if you're able to evaluate a chess position and being able to spot an unprotected piece, it's going to be a game changer for you? Watch this. The knight is unprotected. Clearly, I would love to take that knight, but I'm going to lose the rook. But if I try to take the rook, he's going to take back with one of his pieces, and then it's going to guard the knight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my rook and attack the unprotected bishop. Now the bishop is unprotected, the knight is unprotected, and he's forced to sacrifice the bishop. Now in this position, you have to be careful. I have two ways in which I could take back the bishop. If I take with the bishop, then I'm fine. But if I take with the king, I'm completely lost, and I'm going to lose the game because knight takes e4 is going to be a fork. So let's simply take with the bishop here. We're now just ahead by an entire piece. So now we're just gonna close off the game. The opponent's king is extremely weak, by the way, so we're still trying to look for tactics in this position. And another thing that I'm noticing is the knight is unprotected. The knight is also on our half of the board, so we need to be careful. And one more thing I want to teach you guys is whenever a minor piece is able to move backwards, that's one of the hardest moves for persons to see. For example, the regular person would just be focusing on their half of the board, not seeing that the knight is attacking the queen. But we're going to move the queen, and we know that offense is the best defense. And I'm about to do a very beautiful tactic to show you guys. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start by playing the move queen to h6 check, because we have to look for forcing moves, and a check is usually a forcing move. If the opponent moves the king to e7, then a move like rook to b7 will lead to at least a checkmate, or his king is going to be on the run. But if the king goes to g8, I'm going to play the move queen to g6, which checks the king and attacks the unprotected knight. And before you're back on the screen like, hey, no, it blunders the queen. It doesn't blunder the queen because the pawn on f7 is pinned. And because the bishop is pinning the king, it won't be able to take. So let's start by playing the move queen h6. Let's see how black will respond here. King to g8 was played, and then I'm able to play the move queen to g6. Remember what I told you guys. Here's another tip that I want you guys to follow. I like to give a lot of tips while I'm playing. Another tip that I want you guys to keep in mind is if you're playing your games, I want you to find a way to feel uncomfortable with unprotected pieces, because the moment one of your pieces become unprotected, then your whole position becomes uncoordinated. And if your whole position is uncoordinated, the tactics that you're trying to play on your opponent won't work, and the opponent is going to play tactics on you. So he moves the king. I'm not able to play this. By the way, the knight covers the square. So let's simply take the knight. Now I'm ahead by two bishops. The king is extremely weak. So now we're going for checkmate. So queen to e7 was played. It prevents me from checking on c5. If I could get a queen on h8, that would be a checkmate. So I'm going to play the move queen to h7. I'm threatening a checkmate in one move. So the opponent decided to play queen to f6 to guard the checkmate. So how are we going to do this now? I'm thinking of playing bishop to c5 check. If I play bishop to c5 check and he decides to move the king, I give another check here. The king has to go here. I give another check here. The king then has to go here. But what do I get from that? I'm not seeing what I get from that. So let's do something else. Now, this rook is able to come on my half of the board, so I need to be careful. I'm thinking of playing the move rook to b7. It puts the rook on the 7th. Remember, rooks on the 7th is in heaven. But you have to be aware of the drawback of your move. I'm about to play the move rook to b7, and I'm aware that I'm no longer guarding my d1 square, and I'm aware that the d rook is able to come to d1 and check my king. But if this happens, I'm going to simply move my king. The queen has no more checks, and if he thinks he's being cute and take my bishop, which will be unprotected, then my rook is going to take on f7, and I'm going to win the queen. And if the queen takes my rook, queen takes f7, is going to be a checkmate. Ensure that you were able to visualize that. So let's play the move rook to b7. The game is about to end. This is the time to tell you guys, there is a like button. Hit that like button. Let's play king to h2. There's no more checks on my king. He decided to pull the rook back to d5, so that way I'm not able to take here. That's a very interesting move. Look on what I'm about to hit him with now. Watch this. Watch this. If I check on b8, right? The king has to go to e7. And then I hit him with bishop h4, and I'm pinning the queen. That's one way in which I could win this game. The other way I'm thinking I could win this game is I could actually, because I want my bishop to be open on this diagonal, because I want to win this queen, I could hit him with bishop to c5. The normal person watching this would not have found bishop c5 because the rook guards the square. But remember, if it's a move on the opponent's half of the board, it is a candidate move. So let's say we go bishop c5. If he takes, we take, we win the queen, he gets mate. So let's say he doesn't take. If he does not take, he has to go here. But then queen to g8 is a checkmate. The game is about to finish. Let's go bishop to c5, check. The rook takes on c5. Now I'm going to play the move rook takes f7, check. The king is actually not able to take because queen takes is going to be a checkmate. And in this position, we're going to simply take the... you see, you don't want to be too materialistic in chess. Even though this is a free queen, we don't want to take the queen. It's better to go for a checkmate. That's just a checkmate.